Hello, welcome back to the RotoViz Overtime podcast. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland, and I'm joined as always by Shawn Siegele. You can check all of Shawn's work on rotoviz.com. Shawn, we are drafting over at Underdog once again. It is the Mitten returns. We are past the wildcard weekend. We are moving deep into the NFL playoffs. We're going to draft a team here. Same format as we've talked about on previous Underdog shows. It is a situation where there is 10 rounds. There is 6 drafters, so you get those 10 selections. It goes really quick, but it is a lot of fun. The Mitten is $5 to enter, and if you're signing up over at underdogfantasy.com, you can use the code RotoViz to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. Shawn, what maybe are some of the things people should be looking out for if they are drafting, if they are setting up lineups, versus what maybe we were thinking about 1 week ago?
Well, we've made it to the divisional round, and the 5 true Super Bowl contenders are still alive. They dodged some bullets this past weekend. That means you have 5 viable quarterback plays to play through. Only 5 of the 6 teams will get those quarterbacks. And so one team is going to be playing an upset path to the Super Bowl, to this grand prize. Only one of these 6 teams will advance. Then you'll go into a 12-team league where only one team will advance. The team obviously has to pick the right balance of upside, advance rate potential, and concentration through a specific scenario that will allow you to make it all the way through these 3 weeks and have the best team standing at the end. So we get back to that quarterback decision. The top 3 players in ADP right now: Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. That doesn't come as a surprise. Those are the 3 favorites. From the reality perspective, the 49ers do sneak in there, and Brock Purdy continues to creep up and creep up and creep up. His ADP is around 10, which means that there are a pretty decent number of teams that are getting Christian McCaffrey in round 1 and wrapping that back around to Brock Purdy in round 2. The fly in the ointment, obviously, is that if you have the 6th pick and you don't have the QB and you don't have Christian McCaffrey, it's going to be very difficult to not go with a little bit of a contrarian build. That's not even very contrarian, but just say, look, I've got to have a QB. The best player to go with this here is Deebo Samuel. So you will see Deebo Purdy at the turn, which means then the Christian McCaffrey manager is not going to get a QB to play off of that. So that portion then becomes tricky, especially with McCaffrey. You probably would like to have an AFC QB, but the only one that's not among the big 3 there is Trevor Lawrence. Do you like Trevor Lawrence to come through? So you can see the difficulty of selecting McCaffrey. You can see the difficulty of going with some of the other quarterbacks, because the big difference between the first contest and now is that the running back depth is crushed. And the running backs that you're going to play through, McCaffrey, we discussed the QB problem there. Saquon Barkley, the other big star, he is not expected to advance past this game with the Eagles. So if you build a team around him, then you're operating either from an upset standpoint, a contrarian standpoint, or you're operating just with the idea that I'm going to prioritize advance first and then see what happens at the rest of the tournament. But the issues that we run into here: Kansas City Chiefs, you have Jerick McKinnon, very expensive. That's something that you and I had to deal with in the draft that we're about to discuss. If you have the Bills, you have the 2 players there in James Cook and Devin Singletary. The nice thing there is that at least they're not super expensive. With the Bengals, you have Joe Mixon, who number 1 is bad and number 2 doesn't really fit what they're trying to do going forward. We drafted a lot of Mixon in the first contest because he was so inexpensive going through this Bengals-oriented build. I don't know that that's quite as compelling at this point, especially with the offensive line issues that they're having now. You say, well, maybe they run the ball a little bit more in order to neutralize the pass rush, keep the defense honest. But the flip side of that is just you don't keep your drives going because Mixon is not going to be someone who allows you to create the chunk plays necessary to score touchdowns. So I think you're going to have even more of a Jamar Chase and T. Higgins emphasis. And then the Philadelphia Eagles. You have Miles Sanders. He had an excellent season, finished slowly. Is he the right guy in the playoffs? Do you like his price when you're thinking about some of the guys you're going to have to pass up on? So all of those running backs have some mild positives in that hopefully they'll be with your team as it advances through to the Super Bowl. They obviously have some negatives because they're not stars, and in an individual week, they could be a player who knocks you out. One of the things that we're going to probably see is more running back scoring this coming week than we saw last week from the non-McCaffrey, Eckler, Barkley players. You're going to see some more running back scoring. But also we're going to see some guy come out of nowhere, not really out of nowhere, but it's within these offenses. But a player who seems like a thin play is going to be the guy who emerges and gets you through. But the trade-offs then are it's difficult to build out the entire lineup. So you're thinking about, well, how do I have a Super Bowl team? It's still this idea of we want to play an AFC quarterback, offset that with an NFC contender or vice versa. But the other thing I think that we want to do is on the opposite side of the bracket as our QB, we probably would like to take the upset pick to go with the favorite pick. So if you're playing Patrick Mahomes and the Eagles, then you look at that other side with the 49ers and the Cowboys, and you take some Cowboys late to round out the team. You're trying to benefit from an upset and have both sides of the NFC game. Again, easier said than done. Colm, take us away. How did our draft go?
Yes, we're going to jump into the draft, but Shawn, you mentioned a couple of things there, and I think it is very important to try and strategize where you are moving with the draft, depending on how those opening rounds go and how you think the playoff scenarios may round out. It is a case where it's one quarterback, one running back, 2 wide receivers or tight end, and then 1 flex with 5 bench spots. So trying to round it out so you both have the upside of getting through this week, but also thinking about how you can advance over the next 2 weeks. I think that 1 out of 12 team spot, Shawn, in the conference championships is going to be a tough one to get through. So planning ahead, strategizing throughout, and then trying to make that work with the ADP. And when we get into our team here, we talk through some of the players and some of the picks. I think that is where it's going to get quite interesting for us. So we're going to pull up the team here, look through. We did draw the 101, Shawn. That gives us a situation where I did say this to you while we were drafting it. Sometimes it feels a little bit better if you get the 103 or the 104, where you can kind of take which player is left, because you have Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, Christian McCaffrey going off the board in that order through 5 picks. Sometimes when you have to make that decision at the start, it obviously can be a little less value maybe that you get. But the other part is when you're drafting from the 1 spot, then it is that long wait to get back and hope that players do fall to you. But in this scenario, Shawn, players did fall to us on a couple of different occasions where it made a little bit of an interesting decision choice. So we take Patrick Mahomes. Dream scenario there would be that Travis Kelce would somehow miraculously make it back to you. He doesn't. He goes at the 9th spot. Then we are lucky enough to pair him up with his number 1 wide receiver, and that is Jerick McKinnon at the 12th spot. Then we get Jamar Chase at 13, Ceedee Lamb at 24. That is the last pick of the 4th round, and then Saquon Barkley. So I mentioned some players, Shawn, that did fall to us. We go with Patrick Mahomes. We have done a number of different teams that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, a lot of them led by Christian McCaffrey, who you mentioned when we were drafting is probably the best value off this first round based on the scarcity of running backs in this format at this point. There is obviously a lot of teams that we've done with the Bengals, so a little bit of a different approach here. We have gone with the Chiefs. I guess the first question is, with Patrick Mahomes there, was there any other areas that you were thinking about going rather than going with the Chiefs in this one? And how do you feel for people listening to the show, maybe if they're drafting, is that the kind of order you would go in terms of the quarterbacks? I think I would go with Jalen Hurts over Joe Burrow, but we have Mahomes, Allen, Burrow, Hurts in this draft as the first 4 quarterbacks taken.
Yeah, I wanted to go with Patrick Mahomes both because it would be fun, obviously Chiefs fans, and because he has an easier path through the divisional round than does Josh Allen or obviously Joe Burrow as they match up against each other. You also have this opportunity to get the running back that you need in Jerick McKinnon, even though you prefer to have a player who has a more locked-in workload at that price level. You also have the chance to build across with the Philadelphia Eagles, which I think is just the perfect play. I mean, Eagles, Chiefs, Super Bowl, so hard to get away from that. In this draft, we can see the tricky part of not taking the QB, because Christian McCaffrey goes at the 105, but then at the turn, exactly like we discussed, Deebo Samuel, Brock Purdy. One of the things that I saw last night that I think would just be so frustrating would be situations where the drafter at the turn actually went with an interesting play of Stephon Diggs or Travis Kelce. I don't think that's the way to do it, but you can go Kelce and Brown. You can go Diggs and Brown. And then before it gets back to the Christian McCaffrey drafter, someone who had already taken a QB takes the second one. Again, that's not the way to play it in any direction, but it is something you have to watch out for. It's not a guarantee that the other drafters will let Purdy fall to you, even if they're not that player at the turn. So watch out for that. But here you have Deebo Samuel, Brock Purdy, kind of like we expected. The issue that you run into with the Jalen Hurts build that we see, you have this Hurts Kelce start. That part is perfect. But then if you don't take either A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith with your second round pick, then in many drafts, they're not going to get back to you. So that's the problem with Hurts. Joe Burrow, your problem is just that, especially if you take Joe Mixon there, then Jamar Chase isn't going to get back. This drafter decided to then get their NFC side with Miles Sanders. T. Higgins does come back around for them. So that part, I think, worked out really well. You have to like that build. The team that is off to the best start here is very clearly the Josh Allen team because they take A.J. Brown one spot ahead of us. And then, Colm, the decision that we made, and we discussed as we made it, that it wasn't the right way to play it. We wanted to see how the team would turn out. We went ahead and passed on Devontae Smith, who's the clear-cut pick at that spot, in order to take Jamar Chase, emphasize first-round advance a little bit, but partly also just wanted to see how the team would look if you don't experiment a little bit on some of these early drafts, and especially experiment for a show like this so you could kind of talk through it with the listeners. Then you lose out on some opportunities just to do that thoughtful portion of it. The thing that in some ways you could argue works out in our favor is that Dallas Goedert does not come back to the end of 4. So we would not have been able to put the two Eagles together here. That again, this 101, I don't like. You mentioned the problems it has. You would really prefer in this contest to have somewhere 2 through 4 as your pick. You really don't want to be dealing with the 5 and 6. As many 2 through 4s as possible, I think, is the way to go. But then we take Ceedee Lamb, Saquon Barkley. I think you have to prioritize here, despite the fact that the Eagles are the favorites. But especially as soon as we have passed on Devontae Smith and we don't have the Eagles possibility anymore, the 49ers again, those players are going to be expensive. Now we're trying to put together a Chiefs build that emphasizes both of the upset plays. We're hoping that our path can go through one of them. We're going to be heavy on Cowboys, heavy on Giants, and that part of the build ends up being really fun.
Yeah, and I mentioned some of the players that we got, values that fell. Jamar Chase was one of those. He's usually going in that mid-second round range, last to the first pick of the third round for us there. That was the part that made it really tough to pass up on Chase over Smith. But as you mentioned, it did work out because even though it is just 6 drafters in this, there is also the fact that there is only 8 teams remaining. And if people are trying to stack up in different ways and target games in different scenarios, it is sometimes very, very hard to pair up those teams together. The other 2 players, Shawn, that happened with was Ceedee Lamb and Saquon Barkley, who we took back-to-back. We were talking maybe 4 or 5 picks out. Dream scenario here is Ceedee Lamb, Saquon Barkley make it back to us. And that was exactly how that one did play out. Before they went, you mentioned Dallas Goedert went in the early 4th round. Then it's Juju Smith-Schuster, T. Higgins, James Cook. We get Ceedee Lamb, Saquon Barkley. So I think that worked out absolutely perfectly for us. And then that was where the decision is made as to how this team is going to develop. We went with the underdogs on the NFC side with Saquon Barkley, Ceedee Lamb. When it comes back in the 6th round at pick 36, that is the last pick of the 6th round, we go Tony Pollard for the Dallas Cowboys side of things. We also go again with the Cowboys and Dalton Schultz with that next pick, first pick of the 7th round. So that leaves us with Ceedee Lamb, Tony Pollard, Dalton Schultz, all of the Cowboys. So there is certain scenarios when you're playing through this. Again, the Cowboys and the Chiefs Super Bowl is really the way that we would be. If we go to win this, Shawn, that is what needs to happen here in this scenario. And that would still allow us to have a full lineup based on the players that we would have available. We would also have 2 running back options in Tony Pollard and Jerick McKinnon. If that was the option, we would have Ceedee Lamb, Dalton Schultz. And in a moment, I'll mention here, we have McCole Hardman as an option. In the 8th round, then we went Richie James, who's obviously a New York Giant, and then we went with Justin Watson. So will be able to fill those positional requirements between the Cowboys and the Chiefs. If it's not a Cowboys-Chiefs Super Bowl, this team is not winning this contest. But the other part of it is, Shawn, it's 1 of 6 here to advance this week. It's 1 of 12 next week. The interesting tidbit of that is you mentioned taking Patrick Mahomes because of the potential that they beat the Jaguars more so than being able to pick the winner off that Bengals and Bills game. And that means that with these teams, when teams get through next week, there is going to be some of these teams that make it through, but they're going to have no quarterback, and then they're going to struggle with some of those other positional allocations if it is heavily stacked with Bengals or Bills, and that team gets through, or actually the team advances, I guess I'm trying to say, but the actual NFL team doesn't make it to the conference championship. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that works out next week. And obviously the landing spot, if you do get through, is going to be, there's going to be a bit of luck involved in that. You may get a slightly easier 12-team field to advance through. Shawn, as we fill down through, I mentioned Tony Pollard, Dalton Schultz, McCole Hardman, Richie James, and Justin Watson. Obviously, Watson being a little bit more of a flyer. McCole Hardman hasn't been practicing so far this week. That's why he slid a little bit in this draft. But again, it may not be a case that he's a factor this week. It could be that it is in that game next week, or even in the Super Bowl if the team advanced. What are your thoughts on how we filled out the roster here overall?
I like it. It would have been interesting at the 8-9 turn to have added a Jaguar to play, kind of bringing back this Chiefs Jaguar shootout again to try and get through this first week so that our Chiefs Cowboys Super Bowl, if it does happen, so we're still alive for it, Evan Ingram and Zay Jones go earlier in the 8th round. When you're trying to think through this, you need to be prepared for 8, 9, 10 to be very thin, and you need to know which deep flyers you like and which fit your particular build. You mentioned Justin Watson in the 10th round. His usage has been very minimal as of late, but he is a deep threat who can score touchdowns. He can score multiple touchdowns. One of the things that it's always hard to envision until it actually happens are some of these deep guys scoring. Obviously, just last week, you get players like Cole Beasley coming out of the woodwork, Isaiah McKenzie with the hamstring strain, inactive. Beasley goes out there and scores those points valuable. You had Khalil Shakir, who would have had a big game if he doesn't drop the long pass. Because he's so involved last week, he goes in the 8th round today to the Bills build. Again, that makes sense. Justin Watson, I don't think a lot thinner of a pick than some of these guys who go, in the late 8th, especially if you're building through the Chiefs. So we have Hardman, we have Watson. The problem with building through the Chiefs, and it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in that the guys become a little bit less expensive. But other than Travis Kelce, you know that anything could happen. And so you can't really count on another player to be a foundation portion of it. That's one of the reasons why Juju Smith-Schuster in the 4th round, I think, is tough. I mean, could he be healthy now with this bye week to rest? He's had the concussions during the season. We know that his lower body is always banged up. He hasn't been explosive recently. He did go through that stretch early in the season where he had a couple of games with some run after the catch. But when you're looking at Juju in the early 4th, and Ceedee Lamb, Saquon Barkley in the 4-5 turn, because obviously the differences in the likelihood of those teams advancing, we're still looking to play as much as possible through the best players and to make sure our scenarios work at the same time, balance those two things. I wouldn't have been that excited about Juju at the 4-5 turn, even with our Patrick Mahomes, because then we would end up too heavy on Chiefs and not have enough explosive players to go with him. Again, that's not to criticize that pick. That's a pick on the Jalen Hurts team where that's building an Eagles, Chiefs, Super Bowl theory. You want Juju Smith-Schuster with that, but that allows some talents that we like to fall to us. You mentioned that we needed to have the Chiefs Cowboys Super Bowl. There is also this possibility that if both teams spring the upset in the NFC, and that's obviously not particularly likely, but then you have Giants Cowboys in the NFC Championship game, especially if that game shoots out and we get a large number of points from Barkley and preferably Richie James. But the Cowboys players could score, their team could lose. We could be into the finals with a Chiefs Giants team. That team would also look good with Saquon Barkley, and would be easily able to put together a full lineup because we do have Hardman and Watson. One of the things we would love to see for this team is for Hardman to practice later in the week and be a focal point. We've discussed Kadarius Toney as being the gadget player extraordinaire, but especially with the downfield components of this roster with MVS struggling so much. Hardman and Toney could both be very involved. Hardman, obviously more experienced in the offense, a guy that they drafted and still are emotionally invested in making look good. If he's healthy, which it doesn't appear that he is, but if he's healthy, he's someone who could get a lot of manufactured touches, including touches around the goal line. You'd like to see that element on this particular build.
Yeah, one other player that we did talk a little bit about, but he did go before it got back to our pick, was Kadarius Toney. Would have fit this build a little bit, but that was in the range then where we go ahead and get Tony Pollard. He went in the early 6th round to pick 31 in this one. Just let people listening in who maybe aren't watching this on YouTube, obviously you can subscribe to the RotoViz YouTube channel. You'll be able to see the visual aspect of this as well if you are interested. But the players that are going in those last 3 rounds, you mentioned being able to pivot to which players are of interest, but by ADP and how this all played out in this draft, it is Evan Ingram, Michael Gallup, Quez Watkins, Zay Jones, Khalil Shakir, McCall Hardman, Richie James, Ezekiel Elliott, Samaje Perine, Boston Scott, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Darius Slayton, Ray McLeod, Sky Moore, Cole Beasley, Juwan Jennings, T.Y. Hilton, and Justin Watson. We probably would have took Sky Moore over Justin Watson if that had lasted back to us. He went a couple of picks early, but those are the kind of players that are available in those last 3 rounds. So it does dry up extremely quickly, particularly from round 7 onwards. So just something to be thinking about if you are drafting these teams. It is a case as well. 30-second clock, plan ahead, get those players started, get them added to your queue to be able to make those decisions on the fly as you need to do so. But this is a fun team, Shawn. We are really, again, when you're doing multiple teams, you're able to do some unique things. If you're drafting one team, it may be a little bit more challenging to go with a lineup like this, but playing those scenarios of how it could help you advance and how the teams could progress to then give you those options for full lineups as the contest progresses. What we're looking for here, you were right to point out the Giants side of it. If we get a Giants-Cowboys upset this weekend, that is the NFC Championship, and if we get the Bills losing to the Bengals, that would also give us Jamar Chase going against those Chiefs. So if that could happen, Shawn, that would be pretty much the dream scenario there for us, is a Chiefs versus Bengals AFC matchup and a Giants and Cowboys NFC matchup. But, stranger things have happened. We'll see how it plays out over the course of the next week or so. Enjoy the games this weekend. There's potentially a bonus OT show, but probably not. If we don't get them, make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast, but also to the Stealing Bananas podcast. You'll get that content coming with Shawn and Ben over there. Fantastic stuff every single week. But that is going to do it for today's show. Until we are back, have a good one.